The sun beat down mercilessly on the Arizona desert as Jake Morrison rode his weathered horse through the endless sea of sand and scrub brush. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, protecting his face from the scorching rays that had already turned his skin the color of old leather. Jake was what folks called a drifter, a man with no permanent home who wandered from town to town, picking up work wherever he could find it. For 3 days now, he had been traveling without seeing another soul. His water was running low and his horse was showing signs of exhaustion. The animal's breathing had become labored and foam gathered around the bit in its mouth. Jake knew they both needed rest and water soon, or they might not make it to the next settlement. As he crested a small hill, Jake spotted something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, near a cluster of cottonwood trees that indicated the presence of water, he could see a crowd of people gathered. Even from this far away, he could tell something was terribly wrong. The crowd was too still, too focused on something in their center. Jake urged his tired horse forward, keeping to the shadows of the larger rocks and bushes. As he got closer, the scene became clearer and more horrifying. 3 wooden gallows had been hastily constructed under the shade of the trees. Standing on makeshift platforms with ropes around their necks were 3 Apache women. Their hands were bound behind their backs, and their faces showed a mixture of fear and defiant pride. The crowd below consisted of about 20 men, most of them wearing the dusty clothes of ranch hands and miners. Some carried rifles, others had pistols strapped to their hips. At the front of the group stood a tall man in a black suit and string tie. He held a piece of paper in his hands and was reading from it in a loud, authoritative voice. Jake dismounted and crept closer, staying hidden behind a large boulder. He could now hear what the man in the black suit was saying. The man claimed to be Judge William Hartley from the Territorial Court in Phoenix. He was reading what he called official charges against the 3 Apache women. According to the so-called judge, the women were guilty of murdering a family of settlers just 2 days ago. He claimed they had attacked a homestead 20 miles south, killing a man named Robert Chen, his wife Sarah, and their 2 young children. The judge said the women had been caught with items stolen from the Chen family home, including Sarah Chen's distinctive silver locket and the family's savings of $43 in gold coins. The crowd murmured their approval as the judge finished reading the charges. Several men shouted angry words about savage Indians and the need for justice. One man wearing a deputy's badge called out that hanging was too good for murderers who killed innocent children. Jake studied the 3 condemned women more carefully. The oldest appeared to be in her 40s with graying hair braided with colorful beads. Despite the rope around her neck, she stood straight and proud, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with contempt rather than fear. The second woman was younger, perhaps in her 20s, and Jake could see tears streaming down her face. The third was barely more than a girl, probably 16 or 17 years old. She was trembling visibly, but like the older woman, her eyes burned with defiance. Something about the whole scene bothered Jake deeply. In his years of wandering the frontier, he had encountered many Apache people, and while some were indeed hostile to white settlers, most were simply trying to survive in an increasingly difficult world. These women did not look like cold-blooded killers to him. More importantly, something about Judge Hartley seemed wrong. Jake had been present at several legitimate hangings during his travels, and he knew the proper procedures. Real territorial judges did not travel around the desert with posses of armed men, conducting impromptu trials and executions. Official hangings were carried out in towns with proper documentation and witnesses. This looked more like a lynch mob than a legal proceeding. The supposed judge was now asking if anyone present objected to the carrying out of the death sentence. The crowd remained silent, some men nodding their heads in agreement. Jake could see that the 3 women understood enough English to know what was being said. The youngest girl's trembling had increased, and even the proud older woman's composure seemed to be cracking slightly. Jake faced a terrible decision. He was 1 man against 20, armed only with his old Colt revolver and a rifle. Getting involved would almost certainly mean his own death. But he could not stand by and watch what appeared to be an innocent woman be murdered by a mob masquerading as legal authority. As he wrestled with his conscience, Jake noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Judge Hartley was wearing expensive boots, the kind worn by wealthy men in cities, not territorial judges who traveled rough country. His hands were soft and uncalloused, suggesting he was not accustomed to hard work or outdoor life. Most telling of all, the paper he claimed contained the official charges appeared to be blank from where Jake was hiding. The fake judge was now calling for the execution to proceed. Several men moved toward the ropes that would release the platforms under the women's feet. Jake knew he had only seconds to act. His heart pounded as he checked his weapons and tried to formulate a plan. Drawing his Colt revolver, Jake stepped out from behind the boulder and fired a shot into the air. The loud crack echoed across the desert, causing the entire crowd to spin around in surprise. Every gun in the group was immediately pointed in his direction. But Jake kept his revolver steady and his voice calm. "Hold on there, Judge," Jake called out, emphasizing the title with obvious skepticism. "Before you gentlemen proceed with this hanging, I think we all deserve to see some proper documentation of these charges." The man in the black suit's face flushed red with anger, and what Jake was now certain was fear. "This is none of your concern, stranger. These women are condemned criminals and justice will be served." Jake took a few steps closer, keeping his gun ready but not directly threatening anyone yet. "Well then, you won't mind showing me the official warrant for their arrest and the court documents authorizing their execution. Any real territorial judge would be happy to display proper legal authority." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could see several men in the crowd exchanging uncertain glances, as if they too were beginning to question the legitimacy of what they were participating in. The three Apache women watched the confrontation with growing hope in their eyes. Judge Hartley's hand moved slowly toward his coat, and Jake knew the moment of truth had arrived. Jake watched as the fake judge's hand crept toward his coat pocket, but instead of reaching for papers, the man was clearly going for a hidden weapon. Without hesitation, Jake fired a precise shot that sent the man's hat flying off his head. The crowd erupted in shouts and confusion as several men dove for cover behind rocks and trees. "Next shot won't be aimed so high," Jake warned loudly, his voice carrying across the desert. "Now I suggest everyone calm down and let's sort this out proper-like." The man claiming to be Judge Hartley stumbled backward, his face pale with shock. His carefully maintained composure had completely crumbled, confirming Jake's suspicions that this was no real court official. A real judge would have stood his ground and demanded to know by what authority Jake was interfering with legal proceedings. "You're making a terrible mistake, stranger," the fake judge stammered, his voice shaking. "These women are dangerous criminals. They murdered an entire family in cold blood." Jake kept his revolver trained on the group while scanning for the best defensive position. "If that's true, then you'll have the proper paperwork to prove it. Territorial courts don't conduct hangings in the middle of the desert without proper documentation." One of the armed men, a burly fellow with a thick black beard, stepped forward with his rifle raised. "We don't need to prove nothing to no saddle tramp. These Apache squaws got what's coming to them, and you'd best ride on if you know what's good for you." "I might just be a saddle tramp," Jake replied calmly, "but I've seen enough real hangings to know this ain't one of them. Real judges carry official papers, wear court seals, and conduct business in proper towns with proper witnesses." The youngest Apache woman on the gallows suddenly spoke up in broken English. "Mister, we no kill family. We find bodies already dead. These men, they lie." The fake judge whirled around and barked at her to be quiet, but the damage was done. Several men in the crowd began murmuring among themselves, and Jake could see doubt creeping into their faces. The story was beginning to unravel. "What's your name, girl?" Jake called out, keeping his gun steady. "I am called Morning Star," she replied, her voice growing stronger with courage. "These men find us near dead family. We try to help, but family already gone to spirit world. Men say we kill them, but we no have weapons. We no hurt children ever." The older Apache woman spoke up as well, her English heavily accented but clear. "I am White Dove, medicine woman of my people. We were traveling to trade post when we found settler family, all dead many hours. We try to give proper burial, but these men come with guns." Jake noticed that several items were laid out on a blanket near the gallows, presumably the evidence against the women. From his position, he could see a silver locket, some coins, and what appeared to be other personal belongings. Something about the arrangement bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Those are the stolen goods right there," the bearded man shouted, pointing at the blanket. "Caught red-handed with the Chen family's belongings." "Funny thing about that," Jake observed, taking a careful step closer to examine the evidence. "If these women killed the Chen family for their belongings, why would they still be hanging around the area with the goods?" Wouldn't guilty parties be long gone by now? The fake judge was becoming increasingly agitated. Enough of this nonsense. Men, we came here to see justice done, and that's what we're going to do. This drifter has no authority to interfere with territorial law. But Jake could see that his words were having an effect on the crowd. These weren't hardened criminals or professional killers. They appeared to be honest working men who had been convinced they were participating in legitimate justice. Now that doubt had been planted. Some were beginning to question what they had gotten themselves into. A younger man near the back of the group lowered his rifle and spoke up. "Judge Hartley, maybe we should take these women back to town for a proper trial. If they're guilty, the territorial court can sort it out." "Absolutely not," the fake judge snapped. "Justice delayed is justice denied. These savages must pay for their crimes here and now." Jake seized on the growing division in the group. "Tell you what, gentlemen, why don't we all ride to the nearest town with a real courthouse and let proper authorities handle this? If these women are guilty, they'll hang anyway. If they're innocent, well, I reckon none of you want innocent blood on your hands." The suggestion seemed reasonable to several men in the crowd, and Jake could see them nodding in agreement. But the fake judge and his closest allies were having none of it. The bearded man raised his rifle and aimed it directly at Jake's chest. "I'm tired of listening to this interfering fool," he growled. "Judge, give the word and we'll finish this business right now." Jake found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. He was outnumbered 20-1, with limited ammunition and no cover except for a few scattered rocks and bushes. The 3 Apache women were still standing on the gallows with ropes around their necks, helpless to defend themselves or escape. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, Jake heard the sound of approaching horses. A cloud of dust was visible in the distance, and it was moving fast in their direction. Someone else was coming, and Jake could only hope they would be more interested in justice than in mob violence. The fake judge noticed the approaching riders at the same time, and his face went even paler. He began backing toward his horse, which was tied to one of the cottonwood trees. "We need to finish this now," he hissed to his men, "before anyone else arrives." "Hold on there, Judge," Jake called out sarcastically. "If this is all legal and proper, why are you so eager to leave? Shouldn't you want more witnesses to your righteous justice?" The approaching riders were getting closer, and Jake could now see there were at least 6 of them. The fake judge was clearly panicked, confirming Jake's suspicion that whatever was happening here was far from legal. An innocent man with proper authority would welcome the arrival of more witnesses. One of the men in the crowd, a gray-haired fellow who looked like he might be a ranch foreman, suddenly stepped forward and pointed his rifle at the ground instead of at Jake. "Boys, I'm starting to think this stranger might be right. Something doesn't smell right about this whole business." The crack in the mob's unity was widening, and Jake pressed his advantage. "Think about it, men. When did any of you actually see official paperwork? When did you see a real warrant or court order? You're all honest, hard-working folks, and someone's been playing you for fools." The approaching riders were now close enough that Jake could make out some details. They appeared to be wearing some kind of uniforms, possibly cavalry or territorial rangers. The fake judge saw them too and began moving more urgently toward his horse. "Time to go, boys," he called to his closest allies. "We've done what we came to do." But they hadn't done what they came to do, and that fact was about to change everything. The 3 Apache women were still alive, and now there were witnesses approaching who might be able to shed light on the truth of what was happening in this remote corner of the Arizona desert. Jake kept his gun trained on the crowd while backing toward a better defensive position. The next few minutes would determine whether justice would be served or whether innocent blood would be spilled under the blazing desert sun. The approaching riders turned out to be a patrol of territorial rangers, led by Captain Samuel Hayes, a weathered veteran of many frontier conflicts. As they rode into the clearing under the cottonwood trees, Captain Hayes immediately took in the scene with the experienced eye of a man who had dealt with frontier justice for over 20 years. "What's going on here?" Captain Hayes demanded, his voice carrying the authority of genuine law enforcement. His 5 rangers spread out in a semicircle, their hands resting on their weapons but not yet drawn. The fake judge tried to regain his composure and stepped forward with what he hoped was convincing authority. "Captain Hayes, I am Judge William Hartley of the Territorial Court. We are conducting a legal execution of 3 Apache women convicted of murdering the Chen family." Captain Hayes dismounted and walked closer to examine the supposed judge. Jake noticed immediately that the captain's expression was one of deep suspicion, rather than respect for a fellow law enforcement officer. "Judge Hartley, you say? I've been working this territory for 15 years, and I know every territorial judge from here to California. There is no Judge William Hartley in Arizona territory. The fake judge's face went white as his deception crumbled completely. Several men in the crowd began backing away, finally understanding that they had been manipulated into participating in what was essentially a lynching. The bearded man, who had been the judge's strongest supporter, suddenly looked around nervously, as if searching for an escape route. Furthermore, Captain Hayes continued, his voice growing harder, I happen to know that the real territorial court is currently in session in Phoenix, and no judges have been dispatched to conduct field executions. So I'll ask you again, Mr. Whoever you are, what exactly is going on here? Jake holstered his revolver, finally feeling safe enough to lower his weapon. Captain, I'm Jake Morrison. I came across this scene about 20 minutes ago and something didn't seem right about it. This fellow and his friends were about to hang these 3 Apache women without any proper legal documentation. The Ranger captain nodded approvingly at Jake. You did the right thing, Morrison. This has all the hallmarks of vigilante justice, and I've seen too much of that in my time. He turned back to the fake judge with steel in his eyes. Now suppose you tell me who you really are, and what your real interest is in these women. The man who had been calling himself Judge Hartley looked around desperately at his supporters, but found that most of them were now backing away and avoiding eye contact. The arrival of legitimate law enforcement had completely destroyed whatever authority he had managed to project. We were just trying to see justice done, he stammered. The Chen family deserved better than to be murdered by savages. The Chen family deserves justice, that's true, Captain Hayes agreed grimly. But they deserve real justice, not some trumped-up lynching based on lies and fake authority. He gestured to 2 of his rangers. Cut those women down and remove those ropes, carefully. As the rangers moved to free the 3 Apache women, Captain Hayes continued his interrogation. Now I want to know exactly how you came to have the Chen family's belongings, and I want the truth this time. The youngest Apache woman, Morning Star, spoke up as soon as the rope was removed from her neck. Captain, we tell truth. We find family already dead when we come to Waterhole near their home. All shot, even little children. We try to give proper burial, show respect for dead. White Dove, the older medicine woman, nodded in agreement. We take nothing from dead family. These men, they come after we dig graves. They have family belongings already. They say we steal, we kill, but we never harm children. Captain Hayes examined the evidence laid out on the blanket more carefully. As he did so, his expression grew increasingly troubled. Morrison, come take a look at this. You've got a good eye for details. Jake joined the captain in examining the supposed stolen goods. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. The silver locket, which was supposed to belong to Sarah Chen, was still warm from being recently removed from someone's pocket. The gold coins were arranged too neatly, as if they had been placed there for display rather than hastily grabbed during a robbery. These items were planted, Jake said quietly to the captain. Look at how they're arranged. Guilty parties would have these things scattered and hidden, not laid out nice and neat like a store display. Captain Hayes nodded grimly. That's what I was thinking too. Someone wanted these women to be found with this evidence. He turned to face the fake judge and his remaining supporters. I think it's time we got some real answers about what happened to the Chen family. The bearded man who had been so eager for the hanging suddenly stepped forward with his hands raised. Captain, I swear we thought we were doing right. This fellow told us he was a real judge, showed us papers and everything. We just wanted to see justice done for that poor family. What papers? Captain Hayes demanded. Show me these papers. The fake judge tried to back toward his horse, but 2 rangers quickly moved to block his path. The papers were official territorial documents. You have no right to question my authority. Actually, I have every right, Captain Hayes replied coldly. I'm a captain in the Territorial Rangers, duly appointed by the governor himself. You, on the other hand, appear to be an imposter attempting to incite mob violence. That's a serious crime in Arizona territory. One of the men from the crowd, the gray-haired ranch foreman who had first begun to question the proceedings, stepped forward with obvious embarrassment. Captain, most of us are from the Bartee Ranch about 10 miles south of here. We heard about the Chen murders, and when this fellow showed up with what looked like official papers, we thought we were helping with legitimate law enforcement. I understand, Captain Hayes said more gently. You men aren't criminals, you were just deceived by someone with bad intentions. But I need you all to stay here while we sort this out. You're witnesses now, and your testimony might be important. Jake had been studying the fake judge's face during this exchange, and something about the man's features nagged at his memory. There was something familiar about him, though Jake was certain they had never met before. Then it hit him like a bolt of lightning. "Captain," Jake said urgently, "I think I know who this man really is. About 6 months ago I was in a saloon in Tucson and overheard some miners talking about a confidence man who had been working the territory. They said he specialized in land swindles and had a particular hatred for Apache people because they had interfered with some of his schemes." The fake judge's eyes widened with panic, and he made a sudden dash for his horse, but the Rangers were ready for him, and he was quickly tackled and pinned to the ground. As they searched his pockets, they found several interesting items. "Well, well," Captain Hayes said as he examined the man's belongings. "We have here a collection of blank official-looking papers, several different seals and stamps, and what appears to be a forged identification claiming he's a territorial judge. We also have this." He held up a folded document. "It's a deed claiming ownership of the water rights to this very spot where we're standing." The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, and the picture they formed was ugly indeed. This was not about justice for the Chen family at all. It was about greed, deception, and cold-blooded murder disguised as frontier justice. Jake looked at the 3 Apache women who were now free but still terrified and confused by everything that had happened. They had come within minutes of being murdered for a crime they had not committed, and the real criminals had almost gotten away with it. But the story was far from over, and Jake sensed that the worst revelations were yet to come. Captain Hayes spread the forged deed on a flat rock and studied it carefully in the bright desert sunlight. The document claimed that a man named William Hartley had purchased water rights to this spring and the surrounding 20 acres from the territorial government for the sum of $50. The paper looked official enough to fool most people, complete with fancy letterhead and an impressive-looking seal. "This is a very good forgery," the captain admitted. "Someone put considerable time and money into making this look authentic." He looked up at the captured conman. "What's your real name and what's your game here?" The fake judge remained silent, glaring defiantly at his captors. But Jake had been thinking about the conversation he had overheard in that Tucson saloon, and more details were coming back to him. "Captain, I remember now," Jake said. "The miners said this fellow's name was Franklin Pierce Garrett, and he specialized in water rights swindles. He would forge documents claiming he owned water sources, then try to sell them to ranchers or mining operations." At the mention of his real name, Garrett's defiant expression cracked slightly. Captain Hayes nodded with satisfaction. "Franklin Garrett. Yes, I've heard of you. There are warrants for your arrest in 3 counties. But this is bigger than just a water rights swindle, isn't it?" One of the rangers had been examining the area around the spring and called out from near the cottonwood trees. "Captain, you need to see this. I found fresh graves over here, and they don't look like Indian burials." The group moved to where the ranger was standing. Sure enough, there were 3 recently dug graves marked with simple wooden crosses. The Apache women had told the truth about trying to give the Chen family a proper burial. But as Captain Hayes examined the graves more closely, he made a disturbing discovery. "These graves have been disturbed," he announced grimly. "Someone dug them up after the Apache women buried the bodies." He looked directly at Garrett. "I'm beginning to get a picture of what really happened here, and it's uglier than I thought." White Dove, the Apache medicine woman, spoke up. "We bury family with honor, cover graves with stones. When we return next day to say prayers, graves broken open, stones scattered. We think maybe wild animals, but now we know was evil men." Morning Star nodded in agreement. "We very scared, think maybe spirits angry. We pray and try to fix graves, but then these men come with guns and ropes." Jake was beginning to understand the full scope of Garrett's scheme. "Captain, I think I know what happened. Garrett and his men killed the Chen family, not for their few belongings, but to clear them off this land. He needed the water rights to make his forgery scheme work, but he couldn't have legitimate settlers in the area." Captain Hayes nodded slowly. "That makes sense. But he needed scapegoats to take the blame for the murders. When the Apache women showed up and buried the bodies, he saw his opportunity. He could frame them for the killings and eliminate any witnesses to his land grab at the same time." The bearded man who had been Garrett's strongest supporter suddenly looked sick. "You mean we almost hanged innocent women for murders this snake committed himself?" That's exactly what I mean, Captain Hayes replied. Garrett played on your anger about the deaths and your prejudices against Apache people to turn you into his unwitting accomplices. Several of the men from the Barty Ranch were now looking ashamed and horrified at how close they had come to participating in a terrible injustice. The gray-haired foreman removed his hat and approached the three Apache women. Ladies, I owe you a deep apology, he said with genuine remorse. We were wrong to trust this man and wrong to judge you without hearing your side. I'm truly sorry. White Dove studied his face for a moment, then nodded gravely. You were deceived by evil man. Your hearts wanted justice for dead family, this is good thing. Evil man twisted your good hearts for bad purpose. Jake was impressed by the woman's wisdom and forgiveness, but he was still troubled by some aspects of the case. Captain, there's still something that doesn't add up. If Garrett killed the Chen family for this land, why did he wait around for the Apache women to show up? Why not just file his fake claim and leave? Captain Hayes had been wondering the same thing. Good question, Morrison. Garrett, suppose you tell us why you stuck around after committing murder. Garrett finally spoke, his voice bitter and defiant. Because it wasn't supposed to happen like this. The Apache women weren't supposed to find the bodies and bury them. They were supposed to be found by other settlers, blamed on hostile Indians, and used to justify clearing all the Apache people out of this part of the territory. The callousness of the plan took everyone's breath away. Garrett had not just committed murder. He had tried to use those murders to incite a war between settlers and Apache people. Countless innocent lives could have been lost if his scheme had succeeded. But when these women buried the bodies instead of leaving them to be found, Garrett continued. I had to adapt my plan. I figured I could kill two birds with one stone by framing them for the murders and getting rid of witnesses at the same time. Captain Hayes shook his head in disgust. You're talking about genocide, Garrett. You were willing to start a war that could have killed hundreds of people, all for a few acres of desert and a waterhole. It would have worked too, Garrett sneered, if this interfering saddle tramp hadn't shown up. Jake felt a surge of anger at the man's complete lack of remorse. You murdered a family that included 2 young children and you're proud of it? The frontier is no place for weaklings, Garrett replied coldly. The Chen family never should have settled so far from protection. They got what they deserved for being foolish. Several of the ranch hands had to be restrained from attacking Garrett after hearing his callous words about the murdered children. Captain Hayes quickly took charge of the situation. That's enough, the captain said firmly. Garrett, you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and inciting violence. Men, I'll need written statements from all of you about what happened here today. As the Rangers began securing Garrett and preparing to transport him to the territorial jail, Jake found himself thinking about how close the Apache women had come to being murdered for crimes they had never committed. The frontier was indeed a dangerous place, but not because of the reasons men like Garrett claimed. The real danger came from men who would use prejudice and fear as weapons to disguise their own greed and violence. And Jake realized that this case was probably not unique. How many other innocent people had been victims of similar schemes across the vast and often lawless territories of the American West? But today at least justice had prevailed. The guilty man would face trial, and 3 innocent women would live to see another sunrise in the desert they called home. As Captain Hayes and his Rangers prepared to transport Franklin Garrett to the territorial jail in Phoenix, they discovered that the water rights scheme was far more elaborate than anyone had initially suspected. Among Garrett's belongings, they found a leather portfolio containing detailed maps of water sources throughout southern Arizona territory, along with forged deeds for at least a dozen different properties. This man wasn't just planning to swindle one waterhole, Captain Hayes observed as he spread the maps on the ground. He was attempting to gain fraudulent control over water rights across hundreds of square miles of territory. Jake studied the maps with growing amazement. Each water source was carefully marked with notes about nearby settlements, mining operations, and ranching activities. Garrett had been conducting a systematic survey of the most valuable water rights in the region, preparing to forge ownership documents for all of them. In desert country, controlling water means controlling everything, Jake mused. Ranchers, miners, even whole towns would have to pay whatever he demanded for access to water. White Dove, who had been quietly observing the white men examine the maps, suddenly spoke up. This man, he come to our village 3 moons ago. He asked many questions about water places, where Apache people go to drink. We think he just curious white man, but now we see his evil purpose. Morningstar nodded in agreement. He pretend to be friendly, give gifts to children. But his eyes always watching, always measuring. Our elders say his spirit was dark, but we no understand then. The third Apache woman, who had remained mostly silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. Her name was Silver Rain, and she was White Dove's daughter. My mother has gift of seeing into hearts of men. She know this man was dangerous, but we no think he would kill innocent families. Captain Hayes looked up from the maps with interest. You saw Garrett before the Chen murders? How long ago exactly? It was during the time of the full moon that comes before the hot winds, White Dove replied, referring to what Jake calculated would have been about 6 weeks ago. He stayed near our village for 3 days, always asking questions, always writing in little book. This information put Garrett's crimes in an entirely new light. He had been planning this scheme for months, carefully gathering intelligence about water sources and the people who lived near them. The Chen family murders were not a spontaneous act of violence, but part of a cold-blooded, premeditated plan. One of the rangers had been searching through Garrett's saddlebags and made another disturbing discovery. Captain, you need to see this, he called out, holding up a small notebook filled with detailed handwritten entries. The notebook turned out to be a detailed record of Garrett's activities over the past several months. The entries were written in a code that took Jake and the captain several minutes to decipher. But once they understood the system, the contents were chilling. Garrett had identified 17 different water sources that he planned to claim through forged documents. For each location, he had detailed notes about who lived nearby and what methods he planned to use to eliminate any potential obstacles to his claims. The Chen family was listed as targets for removal, along with dates and plans for their murder. Even more horrifying, they found similar entries for 3 other families in the territory. Garrett had apparently already murdered them as well, though their deaths had been attributed to Apache raids or other causes. He had been conducting a reign of terror across the region, while maintaining the appearance of a respectable businessman. This monster has been killing innocent families for months, Captain Hayes said grimly, and he's been using anti-Apache prejudice to cover his tracks every time. Jake felt sick to his stomach as he read through more of the notebook entries. Garrett had detailed plans for inciting conflicts between settlers and Apache people, hoping to clear the territory of both groups so he could claim their water rights without interference. He was planning to start a full-scale war, Jake observed. Settlers and Apache people would kill each other while he sat back and collected water rights from the empty land left behind. The scope and callousness of the plan was almost beyond comprehension. Garrett had been willing to cause the deaths of hundreds or even thousands of people to make himself wealthy. He had systematically murdered innocent families, then used racist prejudices to deflect blame onto Apache people who had nothing to do with his crimes. Silver Rain had been listening to the conversation with growing anger. This evil man kill families, then try to make people think Apache people are murderers. He want all people to hate us, fight us, so we all die, and he can steal our sacred water places. Her words hung heavy in the desert air, as everyone present contemplated the full magnitude of Garrett's evil scheme. The gray-haired ranch foreman who had apologized earlier removed his hat again and looked directly at the 3 Apache women. Ma'am, I want you to know that not all white folks are like this devil. Most of us just want to live in peace and raise our families. We're sorry that men like him have caused so much suffering to your people. White Dove nodded solemnly. We know this. There are good hearts and bad hearts in all peoples. This man's heart was black as winter night, but your heart seeks what is right. As Captain Hayes continued examining Garrett's notebook, he made another discovery that explained how the con man had been able to operate so effectively for so long. Garrett had been bribing territorial officials to ignore complaints about his activities, and had even managed to get false reports filed that blamed his murders on Apache raids. He's got a whole network of corrupt officials helping him, the captain announced. Clerks in the land office, deputies in 3 different counties, even a territorial judge in Tucson, who's been authenticating his forged documents. Jake whistled low. No wonder he was so confident about his fake authority. He's been paying people to make his lies look official. The notebook also contained detailed financial records showing that Garrett had already made thousands of dollars from his water rights swindles. He had been selling access to water sources he didn't actually own to desperate ranchers and miners who had no way of checking the legitimacy of his claims. He's stolen water rights worth More than most men make in a lifetime, Captain Hayes observed. And he's used the money to buy more corruption and plan more murders. One of the rangers who had been guarding Garrett called out a warning. Captain, this prisoner is trying to get loose. Says he needs to speak with you about something urgent. Captain Hayes approached the bound con man with obvious suspicion. What could you possibly have to say that I'd want to hear, Garrett? Garrett's face was pale with desperation. Captain, you don't understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. This operation involves men much more powerful than me. If you arrest me, they'll just find someone else to continue the work. Then we'll arrest them too, Captain Hayes replied coldly. Start talking. Who else is involved in this scheme? But before Garrett could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation. A large group of riders was approaching from the east, raising a cloud of dust that was visible for miles across the desert. Jake counted at least 15 horses, and they were moving fast. Captain, Jake said urgently, those riders are coming from the direction of the Chen homestead. Could be more of Garrett's men coming to check on their operation. Captain Hayes immediately began deploying his rangers in defensive positions. Morrison, can you handle a rifle? We may need every gun we can get if these are more of Garrett's associates. Jake nodded and accepted the Winchester rifle that one of the rangers handed him. The 3 Apache women quickly moved behind the shelter of the cottonwood trees, understanding instinctively that another dangerous confrontation might be about to begin. As the approaching riders grew closer, Jake could see that they were indeed armed and riding with the purposeful urgency of men on a mission. The lead rider was a tall man in expensive clothes, riding a magnificent black stallion that spoke of wealth and status. That's not good, Garrett said with obvious fear in his voice. Captain, you need to let me go now if you want to live. Those men don't leave witnesses. But Captain Hayes was not about to be intimidated. We'll see about that. Rangers, prepare for potential hostile action, but don't fire unless fired upon. Let's see what these men want. The approaching riders slowed as they neared the spring, and Jake could see that they were all heavily armed with rifles and pistols. The leader was indeed a well-dressed man, who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Good afternoon. Gentlemen, the leader called out as he reined in his horse about 50 yards away. I'm looking for a business associate of mine, a Mr. William Hartley. I believe he was conducting some legal proceedings in this area. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. Mr. Hartley, as he called himself, is under arrest for murder and fraud. I'm Captain Hayes of the Territorial Rangers. Who might you be? The well-dressed man's face hardened at this news. I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding, Captain. Mr. Hartley is conducting authorized territorial business under my supervision. I'm going to have to ask you to release him immediately. And you are? Captain Hayes repeated, his voice growing colder. The man reached into his coat and produced an official-looking document. Territorial Judge Marcus Blackwood from Phoenix. Mr. Hartley is operating under my direct authority, and these proceedings are entirely legal. Jake felt his blood run cold as he recognized the name. Judge Marcus Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in Arizona Territory, with connections that reached all the way to Washington. If he was involved in Garrett's scheme, then the corruption went much deeper than anyone had imagined. But something about the situation still didn't feel right to Jake, and he was beginning to suspect that the real story was even more complicated than it appeared. Captain Hayes examined the document that the man claiming to be Judge Blackwood had presented, but something about it immediately struck him as suspicious. The paper looked authentic enough, but there were subtle details that didn't match official territorial documents that Hayes had seen many times before. This is interesting paperwork, Judge Blackwood, Captain Hayes said carefully, but I'm afraid I can't verify its authenticity out here in the desert. I'll need to escort both you and your associate back to Phoenix for proper verification. The fake judge's face flushed with anger. Captain, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. I have direct authority from the territorial governor himself. If you interfere with official territorial business, you'll find yourself facing serious consequences. Jake had been studying the supposed Judge Blackwood's men while this conversation was taking place, and what he saw confirmed his suspicions. These weren't court officials or legitimate law enforcement officers. They were hired gunmen, tough-looking men with the hard eyes and ready stance of professional killers. Captain, Jake said quietly, take a good look at this judge's men. They're not court officers. Their gun hands probably the same ones who helped Garrett murder the Chen family. White Dove, who had been observing the confrontation from behind the trees, suddenly stepped forward despite the obvious danger. "This man no judge," she announced in her accented English. "This man come to our village same time as Water Stealer. They ride together, talk together like partners." The fake Judge Blackwood's face went pale as his deception was exposed. "You're going to take the word of a savage over official territorial documentation? I'm going to take the word of a truthful woman over forged papers and hired killers," Captain Hayes replied firmly. "Now I suggest you and your men dismount and surrender your weapons. You're all under arrest for conspiracy and murder." Instead of complying, the fake judge wheeled his horse around and shouted to his men, "Take them all. No witnesses." The desert clearing erupted in gunfire as 15 hired killers opened fire on Captain Hayes and his small force. Jake dove behind a boulder as bullets whined through the air where he had been standing just seconds before. The territorial rangers quickly took defensive positions and began returning fire with their rifles. The 3 Apache women had vanished like smoke, using their knowledge of the desert terrain to find cover among the rocks and brush. Jake caught a glimpse of Morningstar moving like a shadow between the cottonwood trees, staying low and out of the line of fire. "Morrison," Captain Hayes shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Can you get to the horses? We need to prevent them from escaping." Jake nodded and began working his way toward where the attackers had left their horses. If he could scatter their mounts, it would be much harder for the killers to escape if the tide of battle turned against them. But getting to the horses meant crossing open ground under fire from 15 experienced gunmen. The firefight was intense but brief. The Rangers were outnumbered 3-1, but they had the advantage of better defensive positions and superior training. Several of the hired killers fell in the first few minutes of combat, and the others began to lose their enthusiasm for the fight. Jake managed to reach the horses and fired several shots into the air to spook them. The animals scattered across the desert, leaving the surviving killers on foot if they tried to escape. As he worked his way back toward the spring, he saw something that made his blood boil with rage. The fake Judge Blackwood had grabbed Morningstar during the confusion and was holding a gun to her head while backing toward one of the few remaining horses. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "I'll kill this savage if anyone tries to stop me." "Let her go," Jake yelled, raising his rifle. "Your quarrel is with us, not with her." "My quarrel is with anyone who interferes with my business," Blackwood snarled. "This entire territory is going to learn what happens to people who cross Marcus Blackwood." But the man had made a critical mistake by revealing his real name. Captain Hayes immediately recognized it from wanted posters he had seen in territorial offices. "Marcus Blackwood died in a Tucson shootout 6 months ago," the captain called out. "I helped bury him myself." "So who are you really?" The fake judge's face twisted with fury at being exposed yet again. "My name is Luther Kane, and I'm going to own every drop of water from here to California. This girl dies unless you let me ride out of here." Jake could see that Kane was desperate and dangerous, exactly the kind of man who would murder an innocent young woman just to make a point. But he also noticed that Morningstar was not the helpless victim she appeared to be. The Apache girl's eyes were alert and calculating, and her body was tensed for action. "Luther Kane," Captain Hayes mused. "I've heard that name before. You're the one who's been organizing the water rights swindles across 3 territories. There's a $5,000 bounty on your head. Money you'll never collect," Kane sneered. "Now back away from those horses or this savage dies." But Morningstar had been waiting for exactly the right moment. As Kane's attention was focused on the men with guns, she suddenly twisted in his grip and drove her elbow hard into his ribs. The impact caused him to gasp and loosen his hold for just an instant, which was all the time she needed to break free. Jake immediately fired, his bullet catching Kane in the shoulder and spinning him around. The criminal leader fell to his knees, his gun flying out of his hand and landing several feet away in the sand. The remaining hired killers, seeing their leader wounded and captured, quickly threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The brief but violent battle was over, and justice had prevailed once again in the Arizona desert. Captain Hayes approached the wounded Kane with his pistol drawn. "Luther Kane, you're under arrest for murder, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. You have the right to medical attention, but that's about all the rights you have left." As the Rangers began rounding up the surviving members of Kane's gang, Jake found himself marveling at how much larger this conspiracy had turned out to be. What had started as an apparent Apache raid on a settler Family had revealed a network of corruption and murder that stretched across multiple territories, but the most important thing was that 3 innocent Apache women were alive and free, and the real killers had been brought to justice. In a land where justice was often hard to find, that was no small victory. In the days that followed the shootout at the Desert Spring, the full scope of Luther Kane's criminal enterprise began to emerge as territorial authorities investigated the evidence found in his possession. Captain Hayes had transported the surviving criminals to Phoenix, where territorial prosecutors were amazed by the extent of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. Jake had accompanied the group to Phoenix to provide testimony, and he found himself staying in the territorial capital much longer than he had originally planned. The case against Kane and his associates was so complex that prosecutors needed weeks to untangle all the fraudulent land deals and water rights claims that had been filed across Arizona territory. During his extended stay in Phoenix, Jake learned that the investigation had revealed connections to similar criminal operations in New Mexico Territory and Southern California. Kane had been the leader of a vast network of con men, hired killers, and corrupt officials who had been systematically stealing water rights and murdering anyone who got in their way. Morrison, we've identified at least 37 families that were killed by Kane's organization over the past 2 years, Captain Hayes told him during one of their meetings with territorial prosecutors. Their deaths were all blamed on Apache raids or other causes, but now we know they were deliberate murders designed to clear valuable land. The scope of the crimes was staggering. Kane's network had stolen water rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars while murdering dozens of innocent people. They had used anti-Apache prejudice as a weapon to deflect suspicion from their activities, nearly succeeding in starting a war that could have claimed hundreds more lives. Jake also learned that the 3 Apache women had provided crucial testimony that helped prosecutors understand how Kane's operation worked. White Dove, in particular, had remembered important details about conversations she had overheard when Kane visited their village months earlier. The Apache women's testimony has been invaluable, the territorial prosecutor, James Mitchell, explained to Jake. Without their eyewitness accounts of Kane's activities, we might never have understood how he gathered intelligence for his crimes. During his time in Phoenix, Jake had several opportunities to visit with Morning Star, White Dove, and Silver Rain. The 3 women were staying in a boarding house while they provided testimony, and Jake was impressed by their resilience and dignity in the face of everything they had endured. Mr. Morrison, White Dove said during one of his visits, our people want to thank you for what you did at the water place. You risked your life for women you did not know, and this shows the goodness of your spirit. Jake was embarrassed by the praise. I just did what any decent person would do. I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people be murdered. Many men would have ridden away rather than face 20 armed enemies. Morningstar observed, your courage saved our lives, and we will remember this always. Silver Rain, who had been the quietest of the 3 women, spoke up with a shy smile. My mother says you have warrior's heart but peaceful spirit. This is rare combination among white men we have known. The trial of Luther Kane and his associates began 3 weeks after their capture and quickly became the most sensational criminal case in Arizona territory's history. Newspapers from as far away as San Francisco sent reporters to cover the proceedings, and the courthouse was packed every day with curious spectators. Jake testified about what he had witnessed at the Desert Spring, describing how he had recognized that the supposed hanging was not a legitimate legal proceeding. His testimony was crucial in establishing that Kane and Garrett had been operating a fraudulent scheme rather than conducting actual law enforcement. The 3 Apache women also testified, despite attempts by Kane's lawyers to have their testimony excluded. Their account of finding the Chen family's bodies and trying to give them a proper burial was particularly powerful, and Jake could see that their obvious sincerity and dignity impressed the jury. During the trial, prosecutors revealed the full extent of the corruption that Kane's organization had fostered among territorial officials. 17 clerks, deputies, and minor judges were arrested for accepting bribes to falsify documents and ignore crimes. The scandal reached all the way to the territorial governor's office, forcing several high-ranking officials to resign in disgrace. This case has exposed the worst corruption scandal in territorial history, Prosecutor Mitchell told the packed courtroom. These defendants didn't just steal money and murder innocent families. They corrupted our entire system of justice and nearly started a war between settlers and Apache people. Kane's defense lawyer tried to argue that his client was just a businessman who had been victimized by dishonest associates, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The notebooks found in his possession detailed his personal involvement in planning and carrying out multiple murders. During cross-examination, Kane's lawyer attempted to discredit the Apache women's testimony by suggesting that they were inherently untrustworthy. This strategy backfired badly when Prosecutor Mitchell pointed out that the women had risked their own lives to give the Chen family a proper burial, while Kane had murdered that same family for money. Which behavior shows moral character? Mitchell asked the jury. Risking your life to honor the dead or killing innocent children for financial gain? The trial lasted 2 weeks and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Kane and his surviving associates. The territorial judge sentenced Kane to death by hanging for multiple counts of murder, while his associates received long prison sentences. As Jake prepared to leave Phoenix and resume his wandering life, he reflected on how much the case had changed his perspective on frontier justice. He had always believed that right and wrong were usually clear-cut in the harsh world of the American West. But this experience had shown him how easily evil men could manipulate good people's prejudices and fears. The real danger out here isn't from hostile Indians or natural hazards, he told Captain Hayes during their final meeting. It's from men like Kane who use hatred and fear as weapons to disguise their own evil. Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully. This case has taught me the same lesson, Morrison. We need to be more careful about accepting simple explanations for complex problems. If someone's trying to blame all the territory's troubles on one group of people, we should ask who benefits from that blame. On his last evening in Phoenix, Jake had dinner with the 3 Apache women at their boarding house. They were preparing to return to their village, but they wanted to say goodbye to the man who had saved their lives. What will you do now, Mr. Morrison? Morningstar asked. Will you continue wandering, or have you found a place to call home? Jake considered the question carefully. His experience at the desert spring had changed something fundamental in his outlook on life. He was no longer content to simply drift from place to place without purpose. I think I'm going to stay in this territory for a while, he decided. There are probably other Luther Kanes out here, and maybe other innocent people who need someone to speak up for them. White Dove smiled with approval. This is a good choice. The land needs men like you. Men who choose what is right over what is easy. As Jake prepared to leave Phoenix the next morning, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of seeing justice done, but a new understanding of his place in the world. The frontier was indeed a dangerous place, but the greatest dangers often came disguised as civilization and law. 6 months after Luther Kane's execution, Jake Morrison found himself back at the desert spring where everything had begun. He was no longer the aimless drifter who had stumbled upon a near lynching that spring day. The territorial governor had appointed him as a special investigator with authority to look into suspicious deaths and land disputes across Arizona territory. The spring itself had been transformed as well. The territorial government had designated it as a public water source, ensuring that no one could ever again claim fraudulent ownership of this vital resource. A small monument had been erected near the cottonwood trees, honoring the memory of the Chen family and acknowledging the courage of the 3 Apache women who had tried to give them a proper burial. Jake was not alone on this return visit. With him were Morningstar and White Dove, who had become his partners in investigating suspicious activities throughout the territory. Silver Rain had chosen to remain with her people, but her mother and sister had decided to work with Jake in preventing future tragedies like the one they had narrowly escaped. The water still runs clear and sweet, White Dove observed as she knelt by the spring. But the land remembers the evil that was done here. It will take time for the spirits to find peace again. Jake had learned to respect the Apache women's spiritual insights during their months of working together. Their understanding of human nature and their ability to read the subtle signs of deception had proven invaluable in his investigations. We've made good progress cleaning up Kane's network, Jake said as he examined his notes. 17 corrupt officials removed from office, 43 fraudulent land claims voided, and 12 other criminal associates captured and tried. Morningstar nodded with satisfaction. But the work is not finished. Evil men like Cain are like weeds in a garden. Cut down one, and others grow to take his place. She was right, as Jake had discovered during his months as a territorial investigator. Even with Cain dead and his immediate organization destroyed, other criminals had attempted to take advantage of the chaos left behind. Some had tried to file new fraudulent claims on properties that Cain had illegally seized. Others had attempted to restart the water rights swindles using different methods. The difference now is that people are more aware, Jake pointed out. Word has spread about Cain's methods, and folks are more suspicious of anyone claiming sudden ownership of water rights or blaming Apache people for convenient crimes. The three had spent the morning visiting with the families of some of Cain's victims, delivering compensation payments that the territorial government had authorized from the recovery of Cain's stolen assets. It was small comfort for families who had lost loved ones, but it represented an acknowledgement that the territory bore some responsibility for failing to prevent the crimes. Their next stop would be a ranch about 20 miles north where Jake had received reports of suspicious activity. According to his informants, a group of men claiming to represent Eastern investors had been pressuring local ranchers to sell their water rights for far below market value. The pattern was disturbingly similar to some of Cain's early operations. The hardest part of this work, Jake admitted as they prepared to leave the spring, is knowing that we can't prevent every crime or save every innocent person. We can only do our best to see that justice is done when we find evidence of wrongdoing. White Dove placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. This is wisdom that comes with experience, my friend. A warrior cannot protect everyone, but he can make sure that evil men know they will be hunted and brought to justice. As they mounted their horses and prepared to continue their journey, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful day, when he had decided to intervene in what appeared to be an Apache lynching. He had found purpose, partnership, and a deeper understanding of both the complexities and the possibilities of frontier justice. The territorial newspapers had begun calling him the Desert Drifter, though Jake wasn't entirely comfortable with the romanticized image they portrayed. He preferred to think of himself simply as a man who had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks and challenging accepted assumptions. Morning. Star rode up beside him as they left the spring behind. Do you ever regret the choice you made that day? Your life would be simpler if you had just ridden past without getting involved. Jake considered the question seriously. His life as a territorial investigator was certainly more dangerous and complicated than his previous existence as a wandering drifter. He had made powerful enemies and faced deadly confrontations on multiple occasions, but he had also experienced the satisfaction of seeing justice done and knowing that his actions had saved innocent lives. No regrets, he said finally. A man has to be able to live with himself, and I couldn't have lived with myself if I had ridden away and let 3 innocent women be murdered. This is why the spirits brought you to that place on that day, White Dove said with conviction. You were meant to be there, meant to stop the evil that was being done. As they rode north toward their next investigation, Jake carried with him the lessons learned from his confrontation with Luther Cain's criminal empire. He had discovered that evil often disguised itself as respectability, and that the greatest injustices were frequently committed by men who claimed to represent law and order. But he had also learned that courage and decency could triumph over corruption and hatred, even in the harshest and most lawless corners of the frontier. The key was having people willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and unforgiving, but also full of possibilities. Somewhere out there were other Luther Cains plotting new schemes, other innocent people facing false accusations, other communities being torn apart by manufactured hatred and fear. But there were also people like Morningstar and White Dove, allies in the fight for justice who brought wisdom, courage, and hope to the work of building a better future. And there were growing numbers of ordinary citizens who had learned from the Cain case to question simple explanations and demand real evidence before rushing to judgment. The work would never be finished, Jake knew. There would always be evil men seeking to exploit fear and prejudice for their own gain, but there would also always be people willing to stand against them, to risk their own safety to protect the innocent and uphold the principles of real justice. As the 3 riders disappeared into the shimmering heat waves of the Arizona desert, They carried with them the hope that truth would ultimately prevail over lies, that justice would triumph over corruption, and that courage would always find a way to overcome hatred. In the harsh but magnificent landscape of the American frontier, that hope was sometimes all that stood between civilization and chaos. The desert drifter had found his purpose at last, and the territory was a safer place because of the choice he had made on a blazing hot day at a spring, where evil had masqueraded as justice. The work would continue, and the fight for truth and justice would go on, one case at a time, one victory at a time, until the frontier became a place where all people could live in peace and safety.